school, and a loyal patron of Maimonides is Sanford Rosenberg. As a leader, he gets things done, and he goads the rest of us to do so. He knows the first rule of leadership: get others to do well and efficiently what needs to be done. Will Sandy please come forward? His loyal support and dedication, his efficiency in organization, and his knack for quick implementation match his skill in communication, his well-known powers of persuasion, and his intensity in oration. Sandy will introduce our renowned keynote speaker, Rabbi Avi Weiss, who is also known for his intensity in oration.
Distinguished rabbis, Congressman McNulty, Marty Belsky, Dean of the Law School, soon not to be Dean of the Law School, I understand. I'm sure you'll find ways to keep busy, Marty. I'm going to take a slightly different tack in introducing Rabbi Weiss. Rather than mention, and that would probably take a long time, the list of activities that Rabbi Weiss is engaged in, I would rather have him tell you what he does. However, I'm going to take this opportunity to tell you what I think he represents. And I'm sure he'll be very quick to correct me. And I invite that if I have misspoken. First of all, to me, he represents the paradigm of Jewish activity and Jewish action. Jewish educators would not subscribe to the aphorism, do as I say, not as I do. Rabbi Weiss is not merely an exponent, but as I said, a paradigm of do as I say and do as I do. Rabbi Weiss is first and foremost a teacher. He's a rabbi of the Hebrew Institute of Riverdale, which serves 700 families and reaches out, I understand, to 4,000 people with his various programs. He's also a professor at Stern College of Yeshiva University. I'm not sure whether those activities are his full-time activities or his part-time activities, because I know, and I think most of you know, that he spends much of his time traveling not only about this country, but about the world. He's a messenger for the Jewish people. He's not merely, however, what some people view him to be, that is, a defender of the Jewish people. Here, in Poland, in Ethiopia, in Russia, in Israel, everywhere. That, I think, would actually diminish what he is doing, to describe him that way. He's not merely going about saying, let my people go, let the Jewish people live in peace, although certainly worthwhile messages. He disseminates everywhere Torah's light. He wills it, that Torah's light penetrates mankind's conscience right to the core. I think if you listen to him carefully, you will perceive the strength and the willpower of Rabbi Avi Weiss. These are my own observations now. I believe this is no age of heroes. Wherever they were, they don't appear to be with us today. I think humanity, because of the effect of modern communication, has become, in a sense, virtually faceless. You would think the opposite. Man's scientific genius and ingenuity eclipses the individual. Only 50 years ago, Europe's most scientifically advanced nation sought to snuff out our light. They sought to snuff out our future. They sought to snuff out our very gene pool, and nearly succeeded in doing in the slaughter of 1.5 million children. This winter and this spring, many of us watched with a horror, but with some kind of fascination, as a part of that, while scuds rained on Israel, and people were waiting for those scuds that might be tipped with German gas technology. No messages needed to be smuggled out to reach the front pages of the New York Times. But even when it was, 50 years ago, that cry was unheeded. With CNN, we became virtual participants in real time to what we thought was an incipient disaster. But this time, interestingly, the world did react. And this is what I found particularly ironic. The world reacted in part very rapidly to prevent Israel from acting in its own self-defense. Offset that against the defenselessness of those who were acted upon 50 years ago. The world didn't react to rescue the defenseless, but reacted to stop us from self-defense. Rabbi Weiss joins us tonight to deliver a message urging Jewish action. It's a clarion call. The question is whether or not we will heed his call. For by our own scientific and technological prowess, we succeed in destroying ourselves. Rabbi Weiss. I think they are heroic proportions. They're almost larger than life. But I want you to know, as you're here in Albany, that you're among kindred spirits. Because we have people here like Congressman McNulty, though sometimes one heart finds it difficult to imagine what an Irish Catholic from the town of Green Island, which nobody knows about outside Albany County, is doing here so vociferously supporting Israel. We're blessed also another kindred spirit is Irving Kirsch, because in any community he is a giant of philanthropy. However, more than that, kindness is his byword. Integrity is his byword. Those things don't always go together. Marty Belsky, I think he found this a bit too much. I wanted to have a word with you about Marty Belsky. We live under a system of the law, not under a system of rule by men. I hope this teaching is successful in teaching the young lawyers in this community to do so. Rabbi, would you feel at home? You're welcome here.
Thank you very much for those kind words. We in the Jewish activist movement know Congressman McNulty very well. He is a real and true friend of Israel and And I know that the state of Israel and its leaders and Jewish people throughout the world are very grateful for his wonderful help. He has all of our appreciation and love. It's wonderful to be sharing this stage with Edith Lukens, as one who has just finished a work called Women at Prayer, a lot of analysis of women's prayer groups. It's always good to be in the company of a woman who receives the Eshet Chayil Award and understands the message of Eshet Chayil Mitzah. It's just a delight to be sharing this moment with you. And of course, this is a time when we acknowledge the yeshiva, we acknowledge higher education, Dr. Swigert. And let me spend a moment offering the tributes to the people who deserve the tribute most. And that is to the Klei Kodesh, the people who really carry the burden and the joy of this yeshiva. Won't you join me in thanking the efforts of Rabbi Rubin and his wife, Rachel Rubin. I know what it is to teach, and I know the challenge of Chinook, and I know the sacrifices that you as a couple, as a family make. And you really have to thank you of the entire community, not only here, but the community throughout the world. That's the message of Am Yisrael, Torah Yisrael, Medina Yisrael. And I'm a bit humbled because this is an evening also of remembering a wonderful, wonderful man, Dr. Morty Berger, who was taken from us at too young an age. There are certain people who are born into this world who we call Midos people. They're just people who are mentioned, wonderful. And that's Morty. Allah Shalom, blessed memory, may he rest in peace. A person who was involved in trying to help others whenever he could. And I think there's a motto about his life that I want us to really try to concentrate on this evening. He was a person who understood that it was not only critical to learn. Theory of Torah isn't enough. But the real crucial question is, can you translate the learning into living, into action itself? After all, what's the use of learning if you don't do? And to do very often, one has to overcome an elementary challenge, but a very basic and real one. And that is the challenge of fear itself. And so this evening I'd like to talk to you a little bit about fear. Because if you're afraid, learning is difficult, because it's difficult to defer or turn the learning into doing. Wherever I have traveled, friends, especially in Europe, amongst my brothers and sisters, I have found fear. I remember May 1985, standing and raising the voice of moral conscience against the President of the United States, who made a terrible mistake in visiting Bitburg, and the next day Bergen does. Our message then was, Mr. President, if you visit Bitburg and if you compare the SS to the victims, please don't come to Bergen-Belsen. And there we stood in the documentation center, 1 million of people, not only Jews, many of our Christian brothers and sisters joined us as well. As a matter of fact, the Jews were so frightened that our Christian brothers and sisters from Germany made up the majority of our group. And I'll never forget what happened towards the end of Shabbat. Finally, the 10th Jew walked in, and we had a meeting. He was the head of the community from Hanover. And first and foremost, I'm a Rebbe. And I'm also a Rebbe who hugs men. It's a European custom. When he walked in, I hugged him and I said, Shalom Aleichem, you make the minyan. And I'll never forget what he said. Minyan? I haven't come to pray. I've come to tell you to leave. You're making it worse. The German Jewry. And as I held his hands, I could feel his hands and I could feel his body shake. Had it been 20 years before, when I knew much less, I thought I knew more, but much less than I know now, I would have been upset and angry. I wasn't angry. I had an American passport. I could come, I could go. He had to remain. I wasn't angry, but I felt pity. Because if we've learned anything from 50 years ago, it is, if you acquiesce to anti-Semitism, you are not lessening anti-Semitism. You are inspiring greater anti-Semitism. If we've learned anything from 50 years ago, it is, if you have no self-respect, no one is going to respect you. I wasn't angry, but I felt pity. And a year later, 1986, when I stood together with the great Beate Karsfeld, Christian Nazi Plankton, together with Sister Rose Theron and Father David Boston, to raise again a voice of moral conscience against the inauguration of Kurt Waldheim, an unrepentant Nazi. And there we stood in Bauhaus Platz, just a few feet from where Hitler and Rose spoke during the Anschluss days. And there were people from Vienna marching by. The young seemed to be very sensitive and caring. But the old, I looked into their eyes as they reached towards Sister Rose and grabbed the yellow star on her lapel. And one screamed, "Schwester, sister, ihr bist nicht kein Schwester. You are no sister." One elderly Jew came up to me, his hand shaking, and he said, "Rebbe, Becky, leave, or they'll break the windows of my store, my restaurant on Judagasse in the Jewish ghetto of Vienna." I wasn't angry, but I felt pity, the fear of this man, that he would in fact be the victim of what happened to his parents 50 years ago on Kristallnacht. And on and on. The following year, when we followed Yasser Arafat Yimach Shemo to Geneva, when he, thank God, was denied entry into New York. And I went to the shul in Geneva and clapped on the Stände and said, "Mein Bruder und Schwester, my brothers and sisters, hold me here. Stand with me. Don't be afraid." Not one Jew from Geneva stood with us. Beautiful Jews, wonderful Jews, but Jews for whom I felt such pity because they hadn't learned to stay. How do you overcome fear? Who doesn't fear? Says the great Avraham Benel, who lived 500 years ago, fear is a feeling. Feelings are feelings are feelings. They're neither right nor wrong, they just are. You can't control a feeling, says the Avraham Benel, but you can control an action. If I'm a squanderer of money and I give charity, that doesn't make me charitable. If I am fearless, and God forbid, forced to go to war, that doesn't make me a hero. But if money means something to me and I still give, that makes me charitable. If I'm afraid and I still stand up and face the challenge, that makes me heroic. The unusual person is the person whose actions run contrary to the feelings. Feelings of fear are therefore not wrong, as long as they don't immobilize us, as long as despite the fear, we still act and we still do. I remember when Arik Sharon, no matter what you think of him politically, militarily, he's a genius. I remember him speaking in our shul, and there were thousands of people, and I introduced him as the fearless soldier. And Arik rose, and he turned to me and he said, "Kavod Harav." I learned that evening, by the way, Kavod Harav means honored rabbi. I learned that when anyone calls you, especially an Israeli, calls you Kavod Harav, you are in So Rick said, "You think I was fearless? Do you think that when I was standing near the Suez Canal throwing pontoon bridges over with our men and women, do you think I wasn't afraid? Only a fool would not be afraid." But the strength of Sharon is, despite the emotion which he couldn't control, it didn't freeze him. It didn't paralyze him. He still did. My Rebbe, the great Rabbi Joseph Ber Soloveitchik, sees it a little bit differently. Listen well. He says, look, everyone is afraid. Fear of aging, fear of sickness, fear of dying. What is the fear? Fear of loss of prestige, fear of loss of profession, fear of loss of friends and relatives and family. Who isn't afraid? But I memorize this sentence of Rabbi Soloveitchik from Al HaTshuvah. Said the rabbi, well, but there is one fear that has the power to remove all the other fears that lurk in the horizon and promise to wreak havoc in our lives. That is fear of God. If you believe in God, belief in anything or anyone else becomes absurd. The higher fear has the power to remove the lower fear. You know who taught this best? My dear friend, Natan Sharansky. He spent his first Shabbat with us at our home. While I'm on Sharansky, there's little to do with fear, but a cute story. Natan doesn't wear a head cover. Not yet. Everything is not yet. You know, Rabbi Cook would say, there's no such thing as the unholy. There is only the holy and the not yet holy. Very, very sweet. You know, the Hasidic Rebbe who said to his students, there's a ladder with 50 rungs, and there's one chassid on the 47th, and the other one on the 25th. Who is higher? The student said, Rebbe, have you gone back? Of course, the one on the 47th rung. And the Rebbe says, no, it depends which way you go. Very sweet, very powerful. So I took Natan back to the airport, and there was a man who was shorter than Natan. You can imagine how short he was. He had a large black yarmulke and just planted it on Natan's bald head. And I'm into exposing people to Torah, not imposing Torah. God was trying to stick it back. But Natan kind of liked his eyes and said, let me be. And this man turns to Natan and he says in Yiddish, this is great for Channel 10 in Albany, and says, give me a bracha, give me a blessing. What was Channel 10? Otherwise we have no shot. And he says, give me a bracha. So Natan turns to me, which means give me a blessing. Natan says, what does he want? I said, Natan, you have now become a Hasidic Rebbe. This man wants a bracha from you. So Natan says, you don't understand. I don't give the blessing. I'm not the rabbi. He's the rabbi. And this man says, well, thank you very much, but I don't want his blessing. I want your blessing. Natan said, do you really want a blessing from me? I'm just not the person to do it. And the man said, I will not move. You give me a blessing. I said, Natan, listen, you've got to make a claim. You could have gone Zig when KGB told you to go Zach, and Zach when they told you to go Zig. But you're not going to beat this man. You've got to make a claim. So give him a bracha. How do I give him a bracha? Just put your hands on his head and recite a blessing. He wants a blessing. So the man looks at me and says, do you really? Natan says to him, do you really want a blessing? He says, yeah. Puts his hand on his head. Looks, okay. Baruch atah Elokeinu melech olam hamotzi. And this man was absolutely ecstatic. These deep spiritual blessings, it was so impressive. He took his yarmulke, went off on his way. It was a good chance to tell you a Natan Sharansky story. I learned this from Natan when Natan in prison wrote, how did I beat the KGB? And Natan is one of the most religious Jews I've ever met. You can be religious and not be observant, not yet. And you can be observant and not be religious. The goal is to mesh the two. The observance to be an external manifestation of the internal sense of spirituality, and Avat Hashem, and religiosity. Natan said, I beat the KGB because I understood the message of Proverbs, Reshit Chachma Yirat Hashem. The foremost wisdom is fear God. If you have the higher fear, it removes the lower fear. Think about it. Abravanel was the person of action. It can't control the feeling, but don't be immobilized by the fear, do. The rub, the philosopher says, the greater the belief, the less the fear that one would have. I have come to you this evening, friends, to tell you that this message of how to overcome fear is just a smattering of a thought. It requires so much more analysis, is important for American Jews. Because it's not only Jews in Europe who are afraid, it's American Jews who are afraid. I have traveled the length and the breadth of this country. I probably speak in as many communities around the United States as any of my colleagues. I have found a Jewish community. With all that America has done from us, we must be grateful for America. A Jewish community that is afraid. And I'd like to share with you some episodes which prove that they're really afraid. First, I received information just a couple of months ago that the Syrians were going to march in the Welcome Home Parade in New York City. After all, they were part of the coalition. I was outraged and incensed. Why, you ask? After all, the Syrians were part of the coalition. I'll tell you why I was outraged. I was outraged because the Syrians blow planes out of the sky, like Pan Am 103. I was outraged because the Syrians level cities, sometimes using cyanide gas, like in Hama. And I was outraged because the Syrians bomb American Marines, as they did in 1983, to the barracks that the Marines occupied in 1983. Why was I incensed? Because Syria today is the center of international terrorism, of international drugs. And as your congressman who has led the way and demanded the extradition of Nazis being held, being harbored and protected in Syria, Syria harbors Nazis to this very, very day. Why was I incensed? Because Syria murders Christians in the thousands, as it's done in Lebanon. And Syria denies elementary human rights to Syrian Jews and the rights to freely emigrate. And Syria has gotten away with what Saddam Hussein couldn't get away with. And that is the annexing of a neighboring country. Because Syria, in fact, de facto, has annexed Lebanon, and tragically, with American approval. So I made contact with the families of the Pan Am 103 victims, and made contact with the families of those Marines who died. And I met them, and met courageous people. Susan Coe, whose daughter Theo, 20 years old, was a student at Syracuse, was blown out of the sky. John Root, who spoke in my synagogue, a wonderful Christian, whose wife, Hannah Marie, at the age of 26, after 4 months of marriage, was murdered. Rosemary Wolfe, whose stepdaughter, Miriam Wolfe, Jewish, was killed. And Kathleen Flynn, whose son Patrick was murdered. And Jack and Judy Young, whose son Sergeant Jeffrey Young, a Marine, was killed. And together we decided to again raise a voice of moral conscience. And we planned a press conference on the steps of City Hall so that Mayor Indians hear our message loud and clear. With a heavy heart I tell you that as I entered into City Hall, I was approached by several politicians, including the president of the City Council, Randy Stein, who called me aside and said, I just want you to know, I've received calls from many Jews in high places who have asked me not to stand with you in protest. Friends, fear. It's bad enough that the Jewish community and Jews in high places were prepared to remain silent and didn't understand that if you push the Syrians out of that kind of parade, you're sending a message to Washington, to the President and to the Secretary of State, that they should, excuse me, not be bedding up to Assad. But worse than that, 50 years after the Shoah, for Jews to actively be involved in trying to undercut that The mayor did something that he told us he would never do. He capitulated. And I'll tell you why he capitulated. He capitulated because of the families of victims of Pan Am 103. He capitulated because of the voice, the moral voice of the families of those who were killed in the Marine barracks. But he didn't capitulate because Jews stood up. Be careful. Sometimes you can be so close to power you're co-opted and you're muzzled and you can't speak freely. You were frightened. You didn't have the chutzpah. You didn't have the guts to stand up. And I tell you now, as the President of the United States pressures Israel and allies himself with Syria, it's unbelievable. America built the Iraqi war machine, made the mistake once, and was forced to destroy Iraq. Now America is building Syria. And if this continues, I predict America, God forbid, will be forced to destroy Syria as America pressures Israel and allies himself with Syria. Just 4 months after we were wearing these gas masks, we dare not be frightened. We have the responsibility to speak truth to power and to tell the President of the United States that 50 years after the Holocaust, we will not let anyone play with the security and with the well-being of Israel. Second episode. I'm the rabbi of Jonathan Pollard. I see Jonathan Pollard every 2 months. Jonathan Pollard committed a crime for which he deserved to be punished. As a naval intelligence officer, he gave secrets to Israel. When you consider that the secrets had to do with the Iraqi chemical buildup, it gives one an understanding of what he did, but still, it cannot be justified. And he's the first one to say that he's not above the law. My friends, those who committed comparable offenses, spying for an ally in a time of peace, and pleading guilty, and working with the government, have received between 3 and 4 years, and sat between 2 and 3 years. Jonathan Pollard is now in his 6th year of solitary confinement of a life sentence. Why? Why this inequity of justice? Why this excessiveness of sentence? Let me say it straight. Jay got life because of improprieties and prejudices and anti-Israelism and, yes, elements of anti-Semitism that tragically still exist in the Justice Department and in the Defense Department. And if I'm opening myself up for a suit, fine. He got it because of the Casper Weinbergers of this world. And he got it because of the Judge Aubrey Robinsons of the world. Rabbi Joe Glazer, the executive director of the Central Conference of American Rabbis, a group of Reform rabbis, recently said, as far as the Pollard case is concerned, I smell anti-Israel and a whiff of anti-Semitism. And not only is the sentence excessive, he's in Marion, the toughest prison in this country, where 95% of the inmates have committed vicious crimes in other prisons. And a year before he arrived at Marion, he spent 10.5 months in a hospital for the criminally insane, despite the fact that Michael Quinlan, the director of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, has indicated that he never ever was treated as a psychiatric patient. For years, the Jewish establishment was silent. Silent. What a perfect. Why? Oh, fear. Because the question they kept asking is, if we speak out for Jonathan Pollard, how will it affect American Jewish security? If we speak out for Jonathan Pollard, won't we be accused of dual loyalty? Let it be said over and over again. The Jonathan Pollard case is not a question of dual loyalty. The Jonathan Pollard case is not only a perversion of Jewish justice. The Jonathan Pollard case is a perversion of American justice. When will the Jewish community finally learn from other minorities? Other minorities, our black brothers and sisters, for example, are not afraid to raise a voice, a noble voice of moral conscience, when one of their own has his or her civil rights violated? Why are we afraid? Fear. I'm happy to tell you that the Jewish community is slowly coming around. 50 prominent Jews from across the country recently signed an amicus brief on behalf of Jonathan Pollard in support of the motion to vacate his guilty plea. Amongst the signatories was Elie Wiesel, who said 5 years late, but he said Jews were afraid to speak up because of charges of dual loyalty. It's about time that we're speaking up. You're not convinced? How come Jews are not going to Israel? How come? How come? I was in Israel during the war. You come to the airports, no one was there. On Pesach, hotels were 50-60% full. Commitment to Israel is not a function the way I carry myself at a cocktail party. Commitment to Israel has everything to do, where am I when the going gets tough? Now is the responsibility for Jews to run to Israel, and not to run from Israel. Fear. Third episode and last episode, and this pains me the most. After I went to Auschwitz to raise a voice of moral conscience against the convent, and by the way, there is another convent, another parish that we now have found in Birkenau, overlooking the landscape of Auschwitz too. Several months later, the primate of Poland, Cardinal Glenn, uttered egregious anti-Semitic canards in a homily which he gave at Czestochowa in front of 150,000 people. Amongst other things, he said that I have come to murder the nuns. I called my dear friend, Professor Alan Dershowitz, and I said, look, he's defaming the Jewish people by defaming me. I'd like to ask him to begin a defamation suit. And that's precisely what he did. The Jewish community was very upset. It was a fear. Don't go one-on-one with the primate of Poland. Look, please, I want peace with all people. But I want to dialogue with my Christian co-religionists with a sense of mutual respect. And so Alan warned the primate that if he steps foot on American soil, he's going to be served with papers. The cardinal backed off and canceled his September 1989 visit. When we heard just a few weeks ago that he's planning to come again, we met with the Consul General of Poland in New York, and again warned you, we didn't want to embarrass Primate Glenn. If he steps foot on American soil, he'll be served with papers. And we decided to sue the cardinal in Poland. Now listen to this, and try not to forget. I'm not a vindictive man. God forbid. This suit had nothing to do with being vindictive or wanting money. And so we sent two of Alan Dershowitz's associates to Poland and asked them to make contact with Cardinal Glenn to see whether Cardinal Glenn would agree to apologize. All he had to do was apologize to Am Yisrael, and we would withdraw and back off. Friends, would you believe, perhaps you've read this in Alan's work, the Cardinal agreed to apologize. But the day before he was to sign that apology, two leading officials from the American Jewish Congress met with Cardinal Glenn. And instead of, as they spoke to Glenn, condemning him for his egregious anti-Semitic canards, they didn't condemn the victimizer, they condemned the victim. And in the front page Solidarity newspaper article the next day, they called me destructive, and they called me an extremist. And when it came time for Cardinal Glenn to sign the apology, he looked around and he said, why should I? After all, the American Jewish Congress has validated my homily. I wrote to the Congress and I said, I want you to know, if ever this goes to trial, Glenn will subpoena the American Jewish Congress to testify on their behalf. My friends, fear. The idea that 50 years after the Shoah, Jews and Jewish leadership could go running hand in hand to Poland, and when speaking to Glenn, condemn the victim and not the victimizer is unacceptable. If we've learned anything from the Shoah, it is that the shtetl mentality doesn't work. The Bunchschweig philosophy is a non-starter. Fear which immobilizes and forces us to capitulate will bring doom upon all of us. It was Nachman Ratzler who said, Kol ha'olam kulo geshet zar ma'od. The whole world is a very narrow bridge. The ha'ikar lo lefached klal. The main thing is not to be afraid. I believe and I know that that's a major task of the yeshiva, to teach the higher fear of God. Gam kelech begay some of it. Lo yirara ki ata imani, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, fear no evil, for you are with me. Friends, 50 years ago the question wasn't only where was God, the question was where was man, where was woman. God didn't kill those people on the St. Louis, Dockville, Florida harbor who couldn't enter into these shores as Jews continue to go to weddings and bar mitzvahs. Mobilized and fear, which is alive and well. This very day, I see you do something about it. If I do something about it, become involved. Never be silent. He said, a great rabbi who had the ability to answer every question. He would travel from shtat to shtat, city to city, state to state, and no one could stop him. Finally, in the back of this crowded room, there stood a little girl who took a little bird in her hands. She said, Rebbe, I have a question you can't answer. Is this bird alive or is it dead? And she thought, listen, if he says the bird is alive, she'll close her hand and kill the bird. If he says the bird is dead, she'll open her hands and the bird will fly away and live. Is it alive or is it dead? And the Rebbe was stunned. He realized the force of the question. He looked out and he said, Dear child, you ask whether this bird is alive or whether this bird is dead. Let me tell you one thing. The fate of this bird lies in your hands. You can let it live, or you can let it die. The bird is this yeshiva. The bird is the Jewish people. The bird is the Jewish state. It's in our hands. We can let it live, or we can let it die. I always ask my parents, my mother, blessed memory, my father, well, my mother who so profoundly affected me when my father was there. It was the generation, the good generation 50 years ago. Let's bless each other. When our children and our grandchildren ask us, where were you 4 months after the Jewish people were wearing gas masks? And the Jewish state was being pushed against the wall. Where were you as Ethiopian Jews that no one called Israel a racist state? The first time in the history of humankind that our black brothers and sisters were taken out of Africa, not in the bowels of ships to be slaves, as occurred in the tragic episode of American history, but taken home to Israel to be loved and embraced. Where were you when thousands of Ethiopian Jews and Soviet Jews were coming home? Where were you as people were trying to revise the history of the 6 million rebuilt convents at all of the camps? Where were you? Were you speaking out? Were you a voice for the voiceless? For the 6 million who could no longer and can no longer defend themselves? Let's bless each other. When we're asked that question by our children and grandchildren, where will we? We'll have to answer. The fate of that bird, the fate of our people, God's help, everything was at the ship. The fate of our people, the fate of our Torah, the fate of our land, the fate of our Israel lies in your hands, lies in my hands. The fate of that